They called her the Death Bride. And as Isolde knelt upon the jagged, frost-slicked stone of the Thornwood Pack Hall, she finally believed them. Her father's heavy signet ring had left a jagged cut across her cheek, the copper tang of blood filling her mouth, but it was the silence of the court that hurt more. Hundreds of her own kind, warriors, cousins, and elders, watched with cold, indifferent eyes as Lord Malachor loomed over her. "A stain," her father hissed, his voice echoing off the vaulted rafters. "A curse born of a traitorous womb." Isolde bowed her head, her long hair falling like a shroud to hide the black crescent sigil on her neck. It pulsed, a rhythmic, mocking thrum. This was the mark that had allegedly drained the life from her mother, Selene. It was the brand that promised a slow, agonizing rot to any mate foolish enough to claim her. In the eyes of the pack, she was not a woman. She was a walking tomb. She waited for the next blow, certain that no one in this world would ever move to save a girl marked by death. She was wrong. High in the shadows of the stone colonnade, Alpha King Fenris of Valdron watched the display with a gaze as sharp as a winter gale. He had come to Thornwood to negotiate a grueling border treaty, escaping the suffocating formalities of the feast to seek the silence of the upper galleries. He was a man built of granite and ice, draped in the heavy obsidian furs of his northern kingdom. If Fenris was a Kien, king, who lived in a sensory void. For 15 years, an ancestral curse had hollowed him out, stealing the ability to feel the world around him. He could walk through fire and feel no heat. He could be cut by a blade and feel no sting. He was a monarch of stone, ruling a kingdom of frost. But as his eyes locked onto the trembling girl on the floor, the void shattered. A sudden, violent heat flared in his chest, a phantom heartbeat that shouldn't exist. The air in his lungs, usually as stale as a crypt, suddenly tasted of ozone and rain. He didn't understand the pull, only that the girl with the black mark was the first thing to make him feel alive since his youth. Fenris didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadows, his heavy boots sounding like thunderclaps against the stone. The mockery in the hall died instantly. The air temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees as the Alpha King descended the stairs. He didn't look at Lord Malachor. He looked only at Isolde. "Stop," Fenris commanded, his voice a low predatory growl that vibrated through the very floorboards. "The treaty is signed, but the price has changed. I am taking the girl." The air in the Thornwood Pack Hall tasted of iron and ancient stagnant grudges. Isolde knelt upon the jagged, frost-slicked stone, her breath hitching in a throat that felt constricted by more than just fear. Her father, Lord Malachor, loomed over her, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the floorboards. Isolde, the heavy signet ring on his finger, had already found its mark. Her cheek burned with a sharp, throbbing heat, and the copper tang of blood pooled against her tongue. Around them, the pack stood in a suffocating circle of silence. Cousins she had grown up with, and warriors she had once respected, watched with eyes like flint, offering no comfort, only the cold weight of their judgment. "You are a blight upon this lineage, Isolde," Malachor's voice hissed, low and venomous, eye vibrating through the silent hall. "A walking grave. Look at the mark. It took your mother, and it will take our future if I allow you to remain." Isolde bowed her head, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders like a mourning veil. Beneath the silk of her collar, the black crescent sigil on her neck pulsed with a dull, rhythmic ache. It was her brand of exile, the death bride's curse. She felt the eyes of the court boring into that hidden patch of skin, waiting for her to wither. Waiting for her to apologize for the sin of existing. She expected the back of his hand again. She braced for the impact, closing her eyes against the flicker of the torchlight, but the blow never came. Instead, a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the hall, extinguishing the warmth of the hearths in a single icy breath. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the gallery didn't just open. They groaned as if bowing to a superior force. From the shifting shadows of the colonnade, a figure emerged. Alpha King Fenris of Valdron moved with the predatory grace of a winter wolf, his boots striking the stone with the finality of a gavel. He was draped in obsidian furs, his skin as pale and remote as marble, his eyes two shards of frozen sea. The pack parted like a physical wound, men stumbling back to avoid his path. Fenris did not look at Malachor. He did not acknowledge the lords or the treaty scrolls laid out on the high table. His gaze was anchored solely on the girl bleeding in the dust. As he drew near, the air grew so cold that the mist of Isolde's breath turned to crystals. "The treaty is finished, Malachor," Fenris stated, his voice a low resonant rumble that commanded the very atoms of the room to still. "But the terms have shifted," Malachor sputtered, his hand hovering mid-air. "Your Majesty, the land rights, the gold." "Keep your land," Fenris said, stepping into the center of the hall. He reached down, his gloved hand firm as he gripped Isolde's arm and pulled her to her feet. For a fleeting second, his eyes widened, a flicker of something, startled, raw, and terrifyingly hot, passing through his glacial expression. "I am taking the girl. She is the only price I will accept." Isolde looked up, shivering not from the cold, but from the sudden violent realization that for the first time in her life, the shadows hadn't come to swallow her. They had come to claim her. All the carriage ride to Valdron was a journey through a dying world of frost. Inside the velvet-lined interior, the air remained unnervingly still, as if the very molecules of oxygen had frozen in the presence of the man sitting across from Isolde. King Fenris stared out the window at the passing skeletal forests of the north, his profile as sharp and unyielding as a mountain ridge. Isolde huddled into the corner, her fingers tracing the edge of her cloak, her mind still reeling from the echo of her father's rage and the suddenness of her rescue, or her abduction. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing against her chest like the weight of deep water. "You are shivering," Fenris said, his voice cutting through the quiet, without him even turning his head. It wasn't an observation of concern, but a statement of fact, as cold and distant as the stars. "I am fine, Your Majesty," Isolde whispered, though her teeth threatened to chatter. Finally, he looked at her. His eyes were a piercing glacial blue that seemed to see right through the skin of her neck, straight to the black crescent mark she tried so hard to hide. For a moment, a shadow of that same strange internal flicker she had seen in the pack hall crossed his face, but it vanished behind a mask of indifference. "Let us be clear before we reach the Black Castle," he began, his voice dropping to a low, resonant drone. "I did not take you out of mercy, nor did I take you for the traditional comforts of a wife. My bloodline carries a winter that no fire can warm. I have not felt the touch of another human being in 15 years, and I do not intend to start now." Isolde blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't understand." "This marriage is a political necessity, a shield for you, and a strategic anchor for me," Fenris explained, his gaze returning to the window. "You will have your own chambers. You will have the protection of my name and the steel of my armies, but there will be no intimacy, no shared bed, no physical contact, no pretenses of affection. My body is a tomb of ice, Isolde. To touch me is to feel nothing. And for you, it would be a slow death. We are two broken things living under one roof. That is the arrangement." Isolde looked down at her hands, feeling the phantom sting of her father's ring, aimed the death bride and the hollow king. It was a grim irony. She was cursed to destroy any mate she bonded with, and he was cursed to feel nothing at all. "I accept," she said, her voice gaining a thin edge of steel. Fenris nodded once, a sharp final gesture. "Good. Do not expect warmth from me, and I shall not expect a heart from you." As the carriage crossed the iron bridge into the shadow of the Black Castle, The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving them in a world of absolute, unfeeling grey. The black castle was a labyrinth of cold obsidian and whispering tapestries, but it was the library that drew Isolde like a moth to a dying flame. It was a cavernous space where the air smelled of ancient parchment and the dust of forgotten centuries. Here, away from the watchful, unfeeling eyes of King Fenris, she could breathe. She wandered the towering shelves, her fingers skimming the spines of leather-bound tomes until she reached a secluded corner tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain. There, nestled among records of the Valdron lineage, she found a small, unassuming book bound in faded blue silk. Her breath hitched. The handwriting on the inside cover was elegant and frantic, a script she recognized from the few scraps of paper her father hadn't managed to burn. It was the journal of her mother, Selena. Isolde sank onto a window seat. On the pale northern sun casting weak light across the yellowed pages, she had been told her whole life that Selena had died because the black mark had drained her of light, that the death bride curse was a parasite that consumed the host and anyone who came too close. But as she read her mother's private thoughts, a different story began to emerge from the ink. Selene hadn't written of a curse. She had written of a burden. "The mark is not a void," one entry read. "The ink smeared as if by a fallen tear. It is a vessel. They fear it because they do not understand the weight of what we carry. To be a moon healer is to be the world's filter. We do not bring death. We take it into ourselves so that others might live. It is a sacrifice of the highest order, often mistaken for a blight by those who only see the surface." Isolde's heart thundered against her ribs, the black crescent on her neck beginning to prickle with a strange, dormant heat. She turned the pages frantically, finding sketches of the same sigil she bore, but surrounded by light rather than shadows. Her mother hadn't been a victim of the mark. She had been overwhelmed by it, trying to heal a darkness that was too vast for one woman to hold alone. The journal hinted at a secondary purpose, a hidden power that lay within the death everyone saw. It spoke of a conduit, a way to draw the poison out of a soul and neutralize it within the moon healer's own blood. Isolde looked out at the frozen ramparts of the castle, thinking of the man who sat in the throne room, a king made of marble and ice. If her mother was right, the black mark wasn't a promise of destruction. It was a key. But as she looked at the warnings of how the transition could break a healer's heart, she realized the truth was far more dangerous than the lie she had been raised to believe. She wasn't a bringer of ruin, she was a bridge. And bridges often collapsed under the weight of the things they carried. The journal sat like a heavy weight in the folds of Isolde's skirts as she navigated the drafty corridors, but her thoughts were interrupted by the presence of Counselor Hester. The woman stood like a sentinel near the entrance to the solar, her face a map of deep lines and weary wisdom. She didn't offer a smile. Instead, she motioned for Isolde to follow her into a small circular room where a fire roared in the hearth. Though it seemed to provide no actual warmth against the encroaching gloom of the castle. "You look for answers in the ink of the dead, child," Hester said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "But the living answer is rotting in the throne room." Isolde pulled her shawl tighter. "The king, he told me he feels nothing. He called his body a tomb." Hester leaned forward, the firelight dancing in her eyes, though her expression remained somber. "It is worse than a lack of feeling, Isolde. The Valdron curse is not a static thing. It is a progression. It began 15 years ago as a numbness in his fingertips, a dullness in his heart. But the frost is greedy. It is moving inward now, crystalline and relentless. He is not merely numb. He is literally turning to ice from the inside out." Isolde felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the northern wind. "Is there no cure?" The healers have failed for generations," Hester interrupted, her gaze piercing. "Every day, see his pulse slows, Every day his blood thickens with a magical winter that no sun can melt. He acts the part of the remote sovereign because he has to. If he allows himself to feel too much, anger, grief, or God forbid, desire, the curse accelerates. His heart is a frozen clock, and it is ticking toward its final beat. He brought you here, not just for a treaty, but because, for one brief second in that hall, you made the clock skip a beat. Hester reached out, her hand hovering near Isolde's neck, though she did not touch the mark. He is a man starving in a blizzard, and you are a flame he is terrified to touch. If he stays away from you, he dies slowly of the frost. If he draws too close, the heat of his own emotions might shatter him instantly. That is the need he will never admit to, and the numbness he uses as his only shield. Isolde looked toward the door, her mind racing. The journal had called her a vessel, a healer who could absorb darkness. She thought of Fenris's marble-cold skin and the terrifying loneliness of a man who was freezing to death in the middle of a kingdom he built to protect him. The truth was a jagged blade. He hadn't just rescued her from her father, he had brought her here to be his final desperate hope, even if he was too proud to ask for it. The moon hung low and silver over the black castle, casting long skeletal shadows across the balcony where Isolde stood. She was clutching her mother's journal to her chest, the weight of Celine's legacy pressing against her heart. She hadn't heard Fenris approach. He moved with the silence of falling snow, a ghost in his own halls. When she finally noticed him leaning against the stone balustrade, his gaze fixed on the frozen wastes beyond the ramparts, she saw the sheer exhaustion etched into his marble features. The internal frost was winning tonight. His skin looked translucent, or almost blue under the moonlight. "I used to wonder what the wind felt like," he murmured, his voice so low it was nearly swallowed by the night. "I remember the smell of pine and the sting of cold, but now it is just a concept, a memory of a memory." Isolde stepped closer, her fear of him eclipsed by a sudden sharp ache of empathy. "My mother wrote about feelings she couldn't share," she said softly. She was surrounded by people, yet she was entirely alone because of what she carried. I think I finally understand that loneliness." Fenris turned his head, his glacial eyes searching hers. For the first time, he didn't look like a king or a conqueror. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of glass. The shared silence between them softened, the grief of their isolated lives weaving a fragile bridge in the dark. Driven by an impulse he couldn't name, Fenris reached out. He intended only to brush a stray lock of hair away from her face, a gesture of rare, distant comfort. But his fingers strayed. His knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of her neck, sliding inadvertently over the raised texture of the black crescent mark. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Fenris gasped, his entire frame shuddering, as if he had been struck by lightning. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pressed his hand firmer against her skin, his eyes widening in shock. For 15 years, the world had been a vacuum of sensation, a hollow void where touch was merely pressure. But here, beneath the death mark, was something impossible. It was heat. Not the mild warmth of a fire or the lukewarm touch of another, but a searing, beautiful golden radiance that flooded his veins like liquid sunlight. It rushed from his fingertips to his chest, shattering the microscopic layers of ice that had encrusted his heart. Isolde gasped, too, feeling a strange, magnetic pull as the mark on her neck began to glow with a faint, ethereal light, drinking in the coldness of his hand and replacing it with her own vital spark. Fenris trembled, his breath hitching as he felt the literal thaw of his nerves. "I can feel you," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, terrifying wonder. "Isolde, you're burning." He didn't let go. For the first time in a decade and a half, the Alpha King wasn't a statue. He was a man on fire, anchored to the world by the very curse he had been taught to fear. The days that followed the first thaw were a delirium of stolen warmth and terrifying intimacy. In the quiet corners of the Black Castle, the distance between the king and his queen dissolved, replaced by a magnetic pull that neither could resist. Fenris no longer looked at Isolde as a political anchor, but as the sun around which his frozen world finally turned. Yet as the walls of his heart melted, and the cold words of their contract were replaced by the soft, whispered truths of growing love, the ancient magic of the Valdron line sensed the shift. The curse was not merely a physical ailment, it was a jealous sentry, designed by a cruel patriarch to ensure that no king of Valdron would ever be vulnerable to the heat of a human heart. The reaction came with the suddenness of an avalanche. They were in the solar, Isolde's hand resting against Fenris's cheek, when he suddenly stiffened, a choked gasp escaping his throat. And the radiant heat he had been drinking from her touch didn't just vanish, it turned into a jagged, internal blade of ice. "Fenris," Isolde whispered, her eyes widening as she saw the color drain from his face. He tried to speak, but his jaw seemed to lock. Before her eyes, the transformation began. It was no longer a slow progression, it was a violent takeover. A web of crystalline frost raced up his neck, spreading like ivy across his features. His skin, once merely pale, began to take on the translucent blue-white sheen of deep glacier ice. He staggered back, his boots crunching on the stone floor as a layer of rime instantly coated the ground beneath him. "Stay. Back," he managed to wheeze, his voice sounding like grinding stones. The air in the room plummeted into a lethal sub-zero. The water in the vases shattered their glass carafes as it froze solid. Isolde watched in horror as Fenris's fingers became rigid, as his joints locking into place as if he were being carved into a statue. This was the killing frost, the secondary stage that Councillor Hester had warned of. By daring to love her, by allowing his heart to beat with a rhythm that wasn't dictated by the ice, he had triggered the final execution. He collapsed against the high-backed throne, his eyes, once vibrant blue, filming over with a milky frozen glaze. He was becoming a monument to his own lineage, a masterpiece of marble and frost that would never breathe again. Isolde reached for him, her own breath coming out in thick white plumes, but the sheer aura of cold radiating from him pushed her back like a physical blow. The man who had stepped out of the shadows to save her was now disappearing behind a shroud of eternal winter, and the very love that had saved his soul was now the weapon used to entomb his body. And the stone walls of the castle's lowest depths felt like the inside of a ribcage, cold and hollow, as Isolde stumbled through the gloom toward the forgotten cell of the oracle. Vala sat amidst a sea of guttering candles, her eyes clouded with the milky film of ancient cataracts. Yet she turned her head toward the door the moment Isolde's foot touched the threshold. The air here was thick with the scent of dried sage and old secrets, a stark contrast to the lethal and antiseptic chill of the floors above, where Fenris sat entombed in his own skin. The ice has reached his throat, has it not? Vala's voice was a rhythmic rasp, like sand moving over silk. She did not wait for an answer, gesturing for Isolde to sit upon a low moth-eaten rug. "You look at your reflection and see a grave, child. You see the black crescent, and think it is the ink of the executioner, your father, your pack. They fed you that lie to keep you small, to keep you afraid of the very blood that makes you holy." Isolde's hand went instinctively to her neck, the mark pulsing with a frantic, feverish heat that seemed to be the only warmth left in the world. "They told me I was poison. They told me I would destroy any man I loved." Vala let out a dry, wheezing laugh. "They mistook the surgeon for the disease. You were never meant to be a bride of death, Isolde. You are a moon healer. Do you know why the moon has no light of its own? Because it drinks the harshness of the sun, so the world can sleep in peace." The oracle leaned forward, her sightless eyes boring into Isolde's soul. "The Valdron curse is a parasite of dark magic. a rot woven into the bloodline by a grandfather who feared his own mortality. It cannot be broken by spells or prayers. It must be consumed. Isolde felt the world tilt. Consumed? A moon healer is a vessel, Vala whispered, reaching out to grip Isolde's wrists with surprising strength. You do not bring death, you eat it. You must draw the darkness out of his marrow and pull it into your own. You must take the frost that is killing him and let it freeze your own blood instead. To save the king, you must become the curse. You must endure the winter he has carried for 15 years, and you must do it all at once. The oracle released her, sinking back into the shadows. The mark is not a brand of shame, little wolf. It is an open mouth. And the question is not whether you can save him, but whether you are brave enough to let his darkness swallow you whole. Isolde stood, the weight of the truth settling into her bones. She wasn't a bringer of ruin. She was the only thing in the world capable of surviving the king's winter by making it her own. The throne room was a tomb of jagged ice, the air so frigid it felt like inhaling shards of glass. At its center sat Fenris, a terrifying masterpiece of blue-white marble. And the frost had climbed his throat and encased his chest, his eyes frozen wide in a stare of eternal, silent agony. Isolde approached him, her boots crunching through the rime that coated the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to flee the lethal cold, but the black crescent on her neck was screaming louder, pulsing with a heat that had become a violent rhythmic demand. She did not hesitate. She climbed onto the dais and pulled his rigid, frozen body into her arms. The contact was agonizing. The cold didn't just bite, it sank into her marrow, seeking to stop her heart instantly. Isolde gasped, her breath blooming in thick clouds, and pressed her mark directly against the center of his crystalline chest, right where his heart had once beaten, with the warmth of their shared secrets. "Take it," she choked out, her voice a thin thread in the howling silence of the hall. "Give the winter to me." As she focused her will, the mark on her neck erupted in a blinding, ethereal radiance. The transfer was not a gentle flow, it was a violent siphoning. Isolde's head snapped back as the first surge of the Valdron curse tore out of Fenris and into her own blood. It felt like liquid nitrogen being poured into her veins. Her skin began to pale, the frost leaping from his body to hers like a living predator. She watched, through eyes filming with ice, as the blue tint began to recede from Fenris's jaw. His skin softened, the marble turning back to flesh, while her own limbs grew heavy and stiff. The pain was absolute. It was the weight of 15 years of numbness, the crushing pressure of 1,000 winters. Isolde felt her pulse slowing to a crawl, her lungs beginning to crystallize. She was dying, becoming the very statue she was trying to melt. Her vision narrowed to a pinprick of light, yet she clung to him tighter, her soul acting as a furnace for the darkness she was consuming. She felt the moment the core of the curse, the black-eyed jagged heart of the grandfather's magic, finally tore free of Fenris. It hit her like a physical blow, throwing her backward onto the stone floor. She lay there, her heart barely fluttering, her skin a map of frost and shadow. The hall went silent. Then a sharp, gasping breath broke the stillness. Fenris fell forward off the throne, his hands hitting the floor. Warm, red-blooded hands that could finally feel the stone beneath them. He scrambled toward her, his face contorted in a mask of raw, human grief. Isolde looked up through the rime on her lashes, her mark now dark and silent, knowing she had successfully eaten the winter. She was a moon healer, and for the first time in 15 years, the king was finally, truly warm. The golden light of a late autumn sun spilled across the balcony of the Black Castle, warming the stones that had for centuries known only the bite of frost. Isolde leaned against the balustrade, watching the valley below where the first harvests of a true summer were being gathered. The air was no longer a weapon, it was a caress, smelling of pine needle and damp earth. Beside her, Fenris stood with his sleeves rolled up, his skin no longer the translucent blue of a glacier, but the healthy, vibrant bronze of a man who spent his days in the light. He reached out, his fingers interlaced with hers, and the sensation was no longer a shock of magic, but a steady, grounding heat. They had survived the breaking of the Valdron line, and in doing so, they had broken the world's perception of what a moon healer was meant to be. The black crescent on Isolde's neck had faded to a pale silvery scar, no longer a brand of shame, but a badge of victory. "A messenger arrived from the south this morning," Fenris said, his voice deep and resonant, no longer carrying the jagged edge of the ice. "Thornwood has fallen. Your father's cruelty finally outpaced his influence." Then the pack rose up when they realized the curse they feared was actually the only thing that could have saved them. Lord Malachor is in exile, and the House of Thornwood is nothing but a hollow ruin of ash and regret. Isolde looked out at the horizon, feeling a strange, quiet peace. The house that had tried to bury her was gone, withered away like dead leaves in a storm. "It was a house built on fear," she murmured. "It was always destined to crumble when the light returned." Fenris turned to her, his expression softening into a look of profound, unshielded devotion. He moved his hand from hers, resting it gently against the slight swell of her stomach. The movement was reverent, a silent acknowledgement of the new life growing within her, a life that had been conceived in warmth and would be born into a world without shadows. "The healers confirmed it," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "A child who will never know the hollow numbness of my ancestors, a child who will never be told they are a stain or a curse." Isolde placed her hand over his, tears of relief pricking her eyes. She had been the death bride, the girl in the mud, the stain on a noble house. But as she stood in the embrace of her king, she realized that the darkness had never been her enemy. It had simply been the soil required for her to bloom. The sun had finally risen over Valdron, and for the first time in an eternity, the kingdom was not just surviving, it was alive.